Edward actually, clearly, at least in my view, was using tactics and weapons which had never been seen on a battlefield before.
That was Richard Barber in conversation with Matt Elton about his new biography of Edward III. Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast. My name is Rob Attar and I'm the editor of BBC History magazine, which is the UK's best-selling history magazine. You can find it in all good newsagents and on subscription. See historyextra.com/subscribe-today for our latest subscription deals. And we also have digital editions available for the iPad, for the Kindle Fire, for Google Play and Zinio. For details of all of these and to purchase your copies, head to historyextra.com/digital. Edward III is often regarded as one of England's greatest monarchs, both due to his personality and his military successes. The 14th century king is the subject of a new book by historian Richard Barber. Richard spoke to our reviews editor, Matt Elton, about the importance of the men around Edward III and the reasons that he struggled later in his reign.
What first prompted you to write this book?
What actually happened was that I'd done a piece on the Order of the Garter for the Dictionary of National Biography, and I met the editor for the DNB medieval section at a party in London for some history award, and I said to him, really, I didn't feel that I'd really done the subject justice, and we talked for a little about it, and then I thought, well, I think this is actually a book, and I would like to research it properly. And I put the idea to my editor at Penguin, who said, yeah, that was fine. So it was actually out of something I'd done already, really.
Okay.
And just feeling that I wasn't happy about the way other writers had treated the Order of the Garter. And then that led back to the Battle of Crecy.
So how much do we know about Edward's early life?
His very early life, really very little indeed. But, of course, his career begins at what we would think is an amazingly early age, because when Queen Isabella fell out with Edward II and left for France, he was only 15. So the actual period when Isabella invaded England and effectively deposed Edward II, he was 16, 17, so that today we call early life, but in the Middle Ages wasn't necessarily so. No. But before that we know very, very little about it at all.
Okay. And then obviously moving forward into him taking the throne, what issues did he face at that point?
Really, the whole thing was in the hands of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who was associated with her in the invasion and then probably became her lover. And it was really his relationship with them that was the problem, because they were actually running the country. In a sense, he didn't come to the throne until after the coup of 1330, when he captured and imprisoned Mortimer and took the reins himself. And really, it was rebuilding trust in the monarchy, I suppose, because Edward II had made such a cock-up of things that it was very much questionable as to how he would manage. Certainly Edward II's favourites were a major issue, and whether he was going to go down that route. So it was really more to do with, it wasn't issues that he had to face, but really more with rebuilding confidence in the monarchy.
Sure. I mean, to what extent do we get a sense of his personality at this early stage, or is...
You begin to get a sense of his personality, and really what's more interesting in a way was the group of people around him and the way he interacted with them, and that's a theme throughout the book. And what emerges fairly rapidly is that Edward's great strength, not necessarily as a king, but just generally, was that he didn't interact with people in the way that Edward II and Richard II did, which was, I am the king. Richard used to make his lords sort of kneel in his presence for hours on at a time, the story goes. Whereas Edward was very much one of a group. All right, whatever it is, primus inter pares, but he was first among equals. Certainly at this stage in his reign.
So, I guess moving on to his military experiences, to what extent did those earlier experiences shape the course of his reign?
Well, I think they shaped his experience. I mean, obviously the invasion of 1326-7 put him on the throne much earlier than he would have been otherwise. And the second stage really is the experiences in Scotland, where first of all there was a stalemate and he was very frustrated on his first campaign, and then the victory at Halidon Hill, which showed a way forward using archers. They had been used before, but not by commanders who knew what to do with them. And in fact, it's interesting that Henry of Beaumont, who was his guardian and tutor in those years, was actually one of the first people to fight a battle in the classic manner, which was to take a defensive position, position your archers in such a way that you covered the enemy approaching you, and they kept falling into the trap.
So, talking, I suppose, about his personality and about those military experiences, do we get a sense of him being stronger as a strategist or as a fighter, or is he both of those things?
He is actually quite an all-rounder in that he is clearly a thinker. At one end, he's a thinker who is well advised and takes advice. I think that's possibly one of the key things about Edward, that he takes advice, whether it's about the reform of the law, whether it's about what to do next in the middle of a battle. He doesn't just sort of say, I know what to do. He doesn't. He sets the agenda, but then lets other people work on it too, and takes advice. It's only in relation to Parliament that he sometimes refuses to take advice, because Parliament is not an organised body, and it's quite difficult to deal with. But his great strength really is this business of acting together with people rather than going off in his own trail.
One thing that is interesting is the idea that he wasn't in any way, well, I don't know, that he wasn't fighting for his country so much as fighting for his own position.
That's an interesting one. He is indeed effectively fighting for the French title on his own personal behalf. But there is an argument that, for instance, the French were the allies of the Scots. The French were already involved in a war with England because they tried, largely unsuccessfully, to send aid to the Scots. So, to that extent, and equally, Gascony, although it was effectively his personal fiefdom, was valued by the English, not only as a source of wine, but it was a valuable trading partner for English merchants. So the the personal ambition crosses over with, he wasn't defending his country, or he wasn't actually reclaiming something that belonged to England, but it was something, there was a crossover between the personal ambition and the wider interest.
The two things are linked.
They're very much linked.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, a lot of the nobles had claims to lands in Normandy.
Okay.
And that you're only talking sort of 3-4 generations back. They were great Norman lords, and they hadn't forgotten it.
Talking, I suppose, about the actual attack on France, I was interested in what that battle might have been like in terms of the battlefield and the techniques that Edward used.
When you say the battlefield, you mean the Battle of Crécy?
Yes.
Yes, particularly. Crécy is very interesting, and it's probably too long to do in more than in less than about a quarter of an hour, so I'll be brief. But the important thing about Crécy, without going into too much detail, is that Edward actually clearly, at least in my view, was using tactics and weapons which had never been seen on a battlefield before. And in brief, new evidence has come to light which indicates that Edward was actually fighting from inside a ring of carts. He was using archers, which in terms of continental warfare were completely new, and he was using guns, which were completely new. And he constructed this ring of carts in open country because there was nowhere which was suitable for the technique that the English had used of getting a defensive position with a narrow covering approach which the archers could cover. So he created it on the battlefield. I mean, this is doubtless going to be argued about, but at least I put it on the table for other people to knock it down.
No, it's fascinating, yes. Yeah. Obviously there's so much here we could talk about. What led to him being able to use all these innovations at the same time?
I think the answer is guns were coming to the fore anyway, and he was interested in new technology. I mean, he had one of the first clocks, public clocks in England at Windsor. He liked new technology and new things, and he, just to think of him as a traditional chivalric king. There's a small element of that, but there are a lot of other things. The archers were an innovation in terms of continental warfare, but it was something that the English had particularly developed. And the other thing is that Edward was very good at improvising, and the Ring of Carts was an improvisation in response to a situation, using something which was known about. You can actually trace this back right into barbarian attacks on the Romans in the 8th century. This Ring of Carts idea is recorded, but chaining them together in this way so that you couldn't break into the ring, and this sort of thing, and the way he used them to place the archers and so on. Yeah. He's somebody who can think and improvise, and it may have been one of his knights who suggested it, but he was open to that kind of suggestion.
That's a good point. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. And how pivotal a moment was this particular battle?
In one sense, very pivotal. In terms of its long-term consequences, not actually, because the point was that Edward was an extremely effective in the field. The English armies were very effective, but what they never worked out how to do was to actually hold the country. I mean, this is a classic problem that you get, that it's one thing to conquer a country, it's another thing to hold it down. And in the medieval period it was exceedingly difficult to do that, particularly if the population was somewhat hostile. And of course by the 14th century your average English soldier had absolutely no idea about French. He might have perhaps in the 12th or 13th, but it wouldn't have been very good French. But basically they were fighting in a country they didn't understand. So discipline and so on and the interaction with the population were pretty poor. And also the English idea of economic warfare was absolutely against their sort of Edward's pronouncement that the population weren't to be harmed.
Okay.
He's trying to do two things at once. The strategy for making a big military impression on the country is absolutely splendid, but having done your great raid across to Calais or your great raid into southwest France, you went away and just left a lot of very people who were not going to, so to speak, vote for you when it came to choosing who was going to be the next king.
Moving on, I suppose, to the Company of the Garter, which is the other theme of the book, one of the other themes.
Yeah.
What do we know about its earliest days?
Very little. This is the real problem, because what seems to have happened, is that the records were kept by the Company of the Garter. It was based in St George's Chapel. There were also canons in St George's Chapel, a college of canons. And it seems, as far as we can tell, that the records were kept in the college. And as early as 1377, there was a visitation, in other words, an inspection of the college by the bishop responsible for it. And one of the things that is noted is that the records are in complete disorder. So we don't actually have any records for official records for the very early period, and the earliest actual mention is in a chronicle about 5 or 6 years later, which people have slightly dismissed because it doesn't correspond with the reconstructed records from 1415 and so on. I actually think it's probably a better source than the actual Garter statutes themselves, which have been scraped together from what people could remember.
Okay, yeah.
So we really know very little about it. All we've got really are the statutes, which we can sort of detect what the original purpose was, and records in the royal accounts of the issue of robes for the annual feast and things like that. And that's all we can sort of go on. And there are sometimes names attached to the issue of robes, so that's one check. But we honestly don't know very much.
No. Okay. I mean, there's two other things there, which is, firstly, what were its aims in being set up?
Well, there you do have some knowledge, because this is rather sweeping, but nobody ever seems to have actually read the statute before writing about it. Because if you read the statutes, there is one military clause. There is something that says you've got to be, a respectable knight, but it's very vaguely phrased, and it's rather like saying you've got to be a gentleman to be admitted to the club. It's as vague as that. There's nothing which says, you will hold a tournament every year on St George's Day. They didn't. I mean, there is one at the very beginning. There's one which happens to coincide with St George's Day, and that's all the evidence there is for regular tournaments. So it's not a chivalric order of knighthood. What the statutes are about is how many masses you have said for somebody who's died, a great sort of table of how many masses an earl has to pay for, how many masses a knight has to pay for a deceased companion. So it is absolutely straight religious confraternity. It's like a guild of knights.
Okay. And the other thing, we'll come back to religion in a minute. The other thing is, you mentioned robes. One thing that's interesting is, beyond all the religious and the military thing, is how the company affected fashion, I suppose, and architecture and music. Do we get a sense of that?
This is really to do with the company's role as part of the sort of royal display at Windsor. I mean, to some extent, Edward is copying the French. And because the French had an order like this, or projected but never really got it off the ground, they also had a royal chapel, and there were certain things about the French royal chapels. And Edward is imitating these French royal chapels, which also had colleges of canons attached, this sort of thing. And they also had very fine music and architecture. The company itself is part of that whole kind of setup. It doesn't actually determine it.
I understand. No, that's cool. So, can you talk me through the role and the character of some of the original members of the Company of the Garter?
Right. These are the tight group around Edward, the major players, who he's known for, by this time, he's known and fought with them for 20 years, some of them. And it's also a number of younger knights who seem to be associated with the Black Prince, who of course was, at the time, only 18 when the Garter was founded. He was 16 when he fought at Crecy.
Wow.
So basically it's the king and his companions, but they are very interesting. In a funny way, the key companion is missing, and that's William Montague, the Earl of Salisbury, who, after Henry Beaumont, was Edward's great mentor. He seems to have been his closest friend, but he was not personally ambitious, and that was a huge help to Edward, because although he was Edward's, if you like, favourite in inverted commas knight, he was not Edward's favourite. In the usual sense of royal favourites. But he was a very important mentor. He seems to have been the ringleader of the coup in 1330. What he seems to have taught Edward is the effectiveness of joint sudden action, and how you could work together. And you see this in the tournaments, the way they fight together, the way Edward fights under the other members of the of a tournament, fights under one of the other members of this small circle. So the impact of somebody like Montague is actually very important. He unfortunately died before the order was founded, and his son, a companion of the Black Prince, was made a Knight of the Garter instead. In a way, the individuals are important. They're all, not all, the ones who the king chose are talented commanders, and they're also his constant companions in the tournaments, and the two are almost synonymous practically. No one individual really stands out. I mean, somebody like Thomas Beecham would stand out anyway, because he's the oldest of the new group of earls who Edward brings in, and somebody like Henry of Grosmont, who was Edward's cousin and a very important figure in Edward's life. But they are important as individuals, but it's really as a group that they're really important.
Sure. No,
a group of like-minded individuals.
Okay. You mentioned Edward's cousin there. How important was family in strengthening this group of men?
It was very important, because certainly even in the early stages, quite a lot of the people are related to Edward. Also, quite interestingly, there are quite strong cross-links between the other individuals who aren't necessarily related to Edward, but a lot of them are related to each other, intermarried, this kind of thing. So relationships are important. Being a member of the royal family was one of the sort of qualifications for being a Knight of the Garter. Towards the end of Edward's reign, his sons all came in, and various relations by marriage come in, until it is preponderantly the royal family.
But it didn't start necessarily that way?
It didn't start that way, no.
Okay. You also mentioned tournaments there. which kind of run through some of the book. How important were they as a social or a political tool?
I think because of Edward's own interests, they were extremely important. At one level, they were a bit like playing golf today. It was where you met people socially at that sort of level and talked to, the sort of traditional view of a golf club, if you like. But they had other real advantages, because they did teach people to fight as a team. They taught people to work as a team. And what you're getting at this point is the change from the big rough and tumble tournament, the melee and the very large numbers on each side, which was another kind of mock warfare, to the much smaller team groups who fought much more one-to-one. And the melee tournament, which was a general tournament, did continue to happen, but wasn't necessarily the most important thing. So you're getting people who are learning to work and fight together. That's one important element. And the other is the friendships and the relationships formed. They are also quite interesting in that there is a period when Edward doesn't hold parliaments, and he goes on a great sort of tournament tour. And there's a slight feeling, as Mark Ormerod suggested to me, that he might actually have been using them to sound out political opinion.
Okay.
Which is interesting because obviously if you've got a lot of the knights gathered together, it was a good way of finding out what they were talking about, and I think Edward did listen.
On a similar note, I suppose, do we get a sense of how interested Edward really was in the idea of King Arthur?
This is an interesting one because he's always quoted as being terribly interested in King Arthur. The actual evidence is that everyone assumes that he was interested in Arthur as in the Arthurian romances. Well, in the Middle Ages there are two Arthurs. There's the Arthur of history, and he was very much a historical figure, and there's the Arthur of literature. Now, Edward was interested in the Arthur of history as a predecessor, as a model for the empire he hoped to rule. He picked up the Round Table idea as a way of, I think, of getting knights together who could then be relied on to provide troops for the next campaign, because he tried buying troops in, so to speak, from Flanders and so on, and had ruined himself in the process. So when the Cressy campaign was mounted, he literally did it out of his own resources. And in a sense also, he did it so successfully. The Round Table had been held in 1344. He never actually got round to properly founding the order. He said, I'm going to found it. Also, interestingly, provided I have enough money. There's some weasel words in his oath which actually boil down to that. And having succeeded at Cressy on his own resources and without the Round Table in place, I think he thought, I can do better than this.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. So how much can we find out about the later experiences of company members?
Well, the two key battles, obviously, are Poitiers and Nájera in Spain. Poitiers is largely fought by commanders who, A, had been at Cressy, and B, were companions of the order. So, in some ways, that's where you really see the Company of the Garter as a social organisation, and a social organisation which means that the commanders communicate with each other and understand what people are doing. I mean, at one point I was puzzled by Jonathan Sumption's query as to why the English fought together so successfully at Poitiers, and my answer is because They were like people on a modern SAS mission, where you really have very little communication. And what they had was a mission goal, which they knew what the object was. They had a broad plan of action, and the Black Prince trusted them to carry it out. It may well be that the famous manoeuvre by the Captal de Buch, who was one of the Knights of the Garter, where he took a small force of about 50 knights and rode clean round the back of the French army and attacked them from the rear, which in fact was very foolhardy, but it caused such panic that it was a very strong factor in the final victory. And that might well have been his own initiative.
So we could just touch on Philippa, I suppose. How key a figure was she in Edward's reign?
I think where Philippa comes in is that she provided an immensely sort of stable background. I think she was clever. I think she, the books that she presented Edward with indicate somebody who knew something about books and learning. I don't think they were simply sort of formal presentations, because they do form quite an interesting group. And I think she was also a wonderful sort of seconder of, or if not leader of the amazing expenditure on display and clothing. I mean, she got into trouble very early on in the reign for total overspend, but Edward realised that this kind of splendour was very important. I mean, there's a wonderful line in Thomas Hardy, "He who seems most kingly is the king," and that was how it worked. And again, Roy Strong's book on Splendour at Court, which shows how it was used later. A lot of that Renaissance splendour is already there in Edward's reign. And Philippa's at the centre of it. Of course, she comes from Flanders, where the really expensive materials were made, and she would know about these kind of things. And indeed, in the early accounts, there are quite a lot of references to things being made in England in the Hainault fashion. And the chroniclers blame the Hainaulters for all these immoral costumes that are appearing, and this is in the late 1340s, and they say they were brought over by the Hainaulters 20 years ago, and that's where all the trouble started. So yes, I think she is quite an important figure, and Edward obviously listened to her. I mean, how true the whole story of the burghers of Calais and her asking for them for mercy for them is, I think, in Froissart's full version, I think it's as much a novel as a fact. But I think she did get them pardoned, and I think she was an influence in many ways.
So we move on now, I suppose, to when things started to go less successfully for Edward.
Yeah.
To what extent, I mean, what are the causes, do you think, of this downturn, I suppose?
Well, I think Edward's political strategy was quite limited, and I think the limitations on it were that he didn't understand, and very few people in his situation have understood and managed to execute a program for bringing the natives over, so to speak. He did understand one thing, which was that the French kings were paranoid about treachery, and they were prone to losing their tempers and executing people on something which looked like a sort of arbitrary whim, because they knew something which couldn't be explained to the rest of the world, and somebody might be executed overnight. with no warning and no trial. And this did happen in both Philip and John's reign. There were executions with very little legal procedure. Now, Edward seems to have realised that this was not a good idea, and also the question of allegiance worked quite well, but he never managed to hold the people who came over to the English side, or he got the ones who actually were pretty devious anyway, like Robert of Artois, and were more of a nuisance than they were worth. So he ended up with an English invasion, successful invasion of France, but no French base, no French clientele, and he never managed to build it up. And so the political strategy was flawed, only that he hadn't been able to solve something which very few people have been able to solve, which is how to conquer a country which is basically root and branch hostile, and which also is hostile because they don't particularly like the idea of, irrespective of nationality, of somebody who is going to rule them when they're used to being ruled with a pretty light rein.
Yeah. Do you think it's right that Edward is regarded generally as one of the best medieval kings? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Certainly one of the most successful. I think that's probably what is best, but he's very successful at what he does, and this is it. But what happens is that the successes of the early years then fade away. There are French defeats. They're defeated by the French and by the Castilian fleet at La Rochelle, and things are not going well by the end of his reign. And in a sense, Richard II was a disappointment for two reasons. One, that he couldn't produce these spectacular victories because the French had changed tactics and were successfully resisting any kind of English incursion. They'd worked out what to do, which was to fight a defensive war, because every time they'd attacked, they'd been taken to pieces, and they forgot that at Agincourt and were taken to pieces again. I mean, any commander who attacked a defensive army without very good reason, and knowing that the defensive army was almost in disarray, was asking for it. I mean, rule one, don't attack. But the trouble was, again, with the French, they were so keen on sort of honour and glory and so on that when Philip of Valois did the right thing and retreated, everybody mocked him for it. And actually, he'd done exactly the right thing. Now, Richard II was a disappointment simply because he couldn't deliver that kind of thing. Now, if that had been the only thing, it wouldn't really have been either here and all that, but he had a totally different attitude to kingship, which was that he was king, and that was that. Everybody else had to jump too. He had favourites, but they were of his own age and not terribly successful, and he fell out in a big way with his with the great magnates. And it's entirely really down to a failure to create kind of social bonds that Edward III did, because he temperamentally wasn't suited to it. The Black Prince equally was not suited to it and had great trouble in Gascony because he was trying to impose things on them the whole time.
It's interesting that personality can have such a big impact on a whole kind of reign and a whole period.
Well, I'm a great believer in the fact that your social history, your the kind of history that the French wrote in the 1960s, even 1970s and 1980s, about communities and so on, is only part of the story, and a single individual can make an awful lot of difference in history. All right, you can say, well, it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the social circumstances. But one person's decision can be massively important.
You write a lot in the book about sources. What challenge is presented in researching this particular period of history?
This is what I tried to show by starting the book by looking, not just at the political background, but actually saying, how do we know what we know? That was the question that the first section was designed to do, because I don't think anybody's quite set it out in this way before, but it is absolutely basic to our understanding of medieval history. Because historically, practically everybody's heard of Froissart, if they've been interested in this period. And for for centuries, Froissart was regarded as the authority, and totally, almost totally taken on trust. And this is absolutely not the case. So having started by saying, well, I tried actually to discount and not use Froissart unless he was supported by something else. And having done that, I then had to work out for myself what was useful and what wasn't. And the sources that were particularly useful were almost invariably chronicles written within 10 years of the event.
Okay.
Preferably chronicles which had been written by people with contacts in the right places. And in fact, in the early part, the most useful one was Jean le Bel's chronicle, because not only had he actually fought with Edward as a knight in the Scottish campaigns, he then became a churchman, particularly grand and very secular churchman, with 30 squires attending him when he went to Mass on Sunday, and great feasts at his house, so that he rather outshone his bishop. Now, Le Bel was talking to the right people, he'd been on a battlefield, this kind of thing. That's very useful. Equally, you get some very intelligent chroniclers who are really thinking at this point what they're doing. They're not just writing down what they hear. There's a wonderful author from much the same part of the world as Froissart and Jean le Bel, the Low Countries, and he's called Gilles Lemuizy, and he was abbot of Tournai, and he was very well placed to hear both the French and English side. Tournai was basically pro-French, but there were a lot of contacts with England. And he writes a wonderful passage about how, when you're in the middle of a battle, you really don't have a clue what's going on, and nobody can actually tell you what happened in any given battle. It is the difficulty of knowing what's going on. And it's fascinating because it's something that's taken up in this century by John Keegan in his really superb book, The Face of Battle, which says very much the same sort of thing. And that is hugely useful. Somebody who really is trying, within 10 years of events, to assess what happened. And sometimes, Winchelsea, in fact, indeed Cressy, Lemuizy actually says, well, was it really an English victory? The English held the field, but in fact he was wrong on that one. It was an English victory. But the Battle of Winchelsea, the battle at sea against the Castilian fleet in 1350, he's very doubtful that it was an English victory. Because he said a large part of the Castilians got away, and the English may still have, so to speak, held the place of battle, but the Castilians didn't want to stay there, and the English actually were in no state to go anywhere else. So, that kind of splendidly sceptical view was wonderful. The other sources, which were incredibly useful and very interesting, but very difficult to, if you like, write history from, are the royal accounts, which are incredibly detailed and very, very interesting in what they tell you about, particularly about relationships between the king and his knights, and things like the fact that there are far more tournaments than we knew about, and some of these tournaments Edward is again fighting under somebody else, because all the armour has the arms of the two other participants, for instance. In one tournament, two other participants, their arms are on everything, which implies that Edward was playing an anonymous, a subordinate role. So those are the things I'd really point at. And again, they're more difficult to use. The letters which the commanders of the army and Edward and the Black Prince wrote home, the problem with those is they'll tell you where they went and what they did, but not when you get to a battle how they did it.
Okay, no. Were there any other particular challenges in writing this book?
The biggest problem was that it was sort of going in three directions at once, if not more, and it was very difficult to keep the material under control, because you ended up writing the whole history of Edward's reign if you weren't careful, and yet you really wanted to focus in as much as you could, and hone in on certain things, but then you've got to link them to the next thing that was coming, which possibly wasn't at all related. So it was really the biggest challenge in the researching was simply the problem was a vast amount of material, and also a lot of wild goose chases after something that looked as though it was interesting and then turned out not to be. The challenge in writing it was to hold the material together, and I think it works, but it was it is quite a it's not just start in 1326 and end in 1377 like a history of the reign. It's much more looking at topics and themes, and that's quite hard to keep together and avoid repetition. I took a lot of repetitions out, but I'm sure there's some still left.
I mean, how long has it taken you, all in, if you had to
Probably
estimate?
about 7 years.
Okay.
Not full time, but yes.
Okay. And what was the thing that most surprised you from your research?
I think the most surprising thing was that in 1328 there's a record of Edward having costumes made, 12 costumes for what he calls or what the accounts call the Game of Cradock. Now, Cradock's a character in Arthurian romance who produces a mantle at court and persuades King Arthur to make the ladies try it on. And according to how faithful they were, the mantle either covered them completely or shrank. And one or two ladies were completely naked by the end of it. Now, obviously this is a kind of chastity test, and what Cradock is actually challenging is the reputation of Arthur's court. In the circumstances, Isabella and Mortimer were having a spectacular affair. What was Edward doing playing this game? I mean, it either says it must have related to that affair. I can't see that it couldn't have done. Now, I can't read it other than some kind of. Edward was he was 16, he was sort of 17, 18 at the time, and whether it was a sort of teenage prank, or whether it really was saying to Isabella, I'm the king, I know what you're up to, and I don't like it. In a not particularly roundabout way, but that's the thing that I was most surprised by. The other thing actually, which was quite interesting, was that there was another example of something that's very rare and which I didn't know of, even though I'd worked on tournaments a lot. A tournament at night in 1329, which again is a good story, and that the king had a special costume which involved a lot of gold thread made for it.
Okay.
Which to me rather implies that it was meant to be dramatic, and he'd ride into the torchlight in this gold costume which would reflect the torches. So there are wonderful little details. I don't think that... I suppose actually the other thing that was a surprise was the fact... yes, there was one very big surprise, and that was that the Order of the Garter was not an order of chivalry, but a religious confraternity, because this hadn't even been suggested, and yet everybody had just assumed it was an order of chivalry because that was what it became. And yet, in my view, the evidence that there is pretty much straightforward that it was not. So, unless you redefine orders of chivalry, I think that was the biggest surprise.
Do you think that this book will, or do you hope this book will change your understanding of Edward, of the themes that you explore?
I hope this book will. I wouldn't claim to make everybody change their understanding, but what I hope they would do is that I hope they'd at least go away and look at it all again and show me where I'm wrong.
Fantastic.
That was Richard Barber. Richard's new book, Edward III and the Triumph of England, is out now, published by Allen Lane. And Matt's interview with Richard formed the basis of an article in our September issue, which is out now. Also in the September edition, we've got articles about Waterloo, medieval letter writing, the Civil War, vampire attacks, and the Battle of Flodden. And if you happen to have an iPad, you'll be able to enjoy an interactive version of the Flodden article, featuring a series of maps of the battle, and video and audio commentary from historian George Goodwin. You can find the BBC History Magazine iPad app at the newsstand. And that's almost all for this week. Do get in touch with your views on podcast@historyextra.com, and we might well read out some of your messages in future episodes. And you can follow us on Twitter @historyextra. We're also on Facebook, facebook.com/historyextra. Plus, don't forget to visit our website, historyextra.com, for all the latest history news, blogs, image galleries, quizzes, and more. You'll also get the chance to have your say on some of the hottest historical topics at the moment. In next week's podcast, we'll be on the road with Mark Stoyle, visiting an important location from the Civil War. Do come along with us for that. The History Extra weekly podcast is recorded in Bristol and produced by Jack Fletcher.